welcome back to our next episode of Watson Drops, the GM Update. I'm Kirby Dolak from LCTV. And today, again, we're back with LELWD General Manager Nick Lawler to discuss two topics. One is mutual aid and a recent news article or news articles that paint the potential for electric rolling blackouts this winter for New England. Good morning, Nick, and welcome back to Watson Drops.
How you doing, Kirby? Way to grab attention, too, with that headline, huh?
Yeah, really. So we've got two very interesting topics to talk about, but let's climb into the first subject, mutual aid and how that applies to a community power company. Most Littleton residents are somewhat familiar with what mutual aid agreements are between towns for police and fire departments. The basic concept being that if some emergency event occurs, that the local municipalities safety services that are adjacent in an adjacent community or town through a well-defined agreement will come to each other's aid. And this can be by providing additional physical resources or equipment to the stricken community, and that is then managed by that local safety department who best knows how to deploy the resources. Now, we've all seen and heard examples of this during multiple alarm fires where surrounding communities respond and assist, but other than helping local or statewide municipalities that are, having extreme weather, wind, ice storm events, how does this all work? The LELWD found itself in Florida, assisting with Hurricane Ian's rebuild. And how long were you and the crews in Florida? And we assume no day trips to Disneyland?
Yeah. Mutual aid has always been really a huge part of the Littleton Electric Light Department. Going back to the early 90s, working through the Northeast Public Power Association, which is right next door now in Littleton. They're more of a training association that trains our line workers and managers and meter technicians and technical staff, substations, stuff like that. But the two other things that they do is one's mutual aid and one's advocacy. So really, those are the three things that as a region bring us together, training, education, mutual aid, and advocacy. Because those are really the three things that we can really benefit from a community standpoint, partnering with our peer utilities. And again, that goes back, I think the original agreement was signed in 1990, or right around then, between all 70 public power communities in New England. And we even have some ties to New York in that matter, because a lot of these storms, they're either coastal or they come in off the Great Lakes, and we're pretty diverse with upstate New York with how these storms hit. And you see them here in Littleton. We're not, unfortunately, we don't live in a bubble that storms miss us, and we've seen them. We've seen large ones. The 2008 ice storm is one that I'm sure if you were here, you remember. And that was followed by other storms right around that same period. We had a Halloween snowstorm that had the oak leaves were still on the trees, and a bunch of oak trees came down all over our territory. And we put a lot of funds back into our infrastructure over the last 15 years to try to help the impact from these storms. And we have a very robust tree trimming program to try to help. But that being said, these storms continue to hit us, and always will. It's just we live in New England, and there's storms. It's typically winter storms. God forbid a hurricane, because I don't know what a hurricane would do to us. It's been a long time since we had a hurricane hit us. So you see mutual aid crews here. We've had crews from Chicopee and Wakefield and Middleton, and they've been here through a lot of those storms. And it's really a low-cost, effective way to get similarly trained linemen into our territory to help restoration. That changed a little bit with Hurricane Sandy, and that's kind of how it really exploded nationally. Though we've had a national presence again that goes back to probably the 80s. We were in St. Croix, St. Thomas in '89. St. Croix in '89. We were in the Virgin Islands in '95. Virgin Islands again in 2017. Hurricane Charlie that hit, I believe, in '06. We were in Florida. Big response to Irma after Irma in Florida. So we've had a national presence for a while, but really the national program formalized during Sandy. And Sandy was a hurricane that was headed our way. It obviously made a bigger impact in New York, but Sandy, Irene, those were a couple that were headed our way. And what we found is through the American Public Power Association, they didn't have a formalized program, didn't know who to call in New England to report back to the Department of Energy and Homeland Security on what we were doing to protect our customers and to have a successful restoration, that they formalized a national program. Which is why now with Irma, Maria, Hurricane Michael, there's been a few over the last 5 years that Hurricane Dorian that didn't have even hit, I don't think even made landfall. We've had contributions to mutual aid program. I think I answered your question. A long answer.
Oh yeah, I mean that was good. That was good. So let's get back to some of the real basic issues here. So whenever the line crews are out doing a job and they need a part, they go back to 39 Air Road and they pick up more fuel, poles, transformers, wires, brackets, lunch, whatever. But they're in Florida, and I'm assuming that some of the agreements they're referring to kind of outline at a high level how things will work. But I do recall seeing some of the pictures you shared with me. There's this stop at a pilot gas station, and all I saw was electric utility vehicles that were from, some places on the South Shore or out west or whatever, forming up, going down as a convoy or not. And then the logistical issues, once you arrive wherever you've been determined that's where you need to go, who's in charge, where you go for supplies, because there again were other pictures where I saw, pole trailers behind trucks. So how does that all work, Nick?
Yeah, probably not a long answer for you.
That's okay.
So how does it all work? So we went down as with 56 utility professionals. And again, we've been down Dorian, Michael, Irma, Maria. We were getting ready to mobilize for Florence. So we've been through a few of these now. We're kind of learning lessons after each one on how to staff them, how to get down there, and lessons learned type of thing. I am the mutual aid network coordinator for our region nationally. It's myself and a gentleman from Holden, Massachusetts, Barry Tupper, who's an operational minded individual. So it's two of us that kind of form these teams. I'm also the chair of the mutual aid committee for NEPA, and Dave Ketchen from Littleton is the vice chair. So we kind of work hand in hand with Barry trying to formalize these teams. And as you can imagine, they're political. You get a lot of volunteers, and you try to do form the best team that you can that keeps the region happy, because it is an association response to a national event, but also make sure that you can respond safely and get home. That's obviously the number one mission, is make sure we have the staff that understand what your mission is, what your job is, have supervision in place to make sure that the job gets done safely, and the proper PPE is being adhered to, and people wearing the gloves and the grounding and all the good stuff that our training gives us when we respond to an area that we might be unfamiliar with. Your training truly is top priority when you enter these types of situations. So we, like I said, we have 56 individuals. They came from 24 different systems, 23 which are Massachusetts, and one from Wallingford, Connecticut. So myself, Dave, and Barry kind of formalized the team. I led that team down to Florida. There's a few individuals in the region that could handle that task. Dave Ketchen being one. Dave's been on these as well. And really, it's just an experience thing. It's an experience. If you've been there before and understand the situation, what you're walking into, what you need to do to get home safely, then you can lead these efforts.
So paint the picture for us, Nick. You said that you arrived in Florida. You had, I'm assuming, 24 trucks, something along that line?
Well, a little bit more. We had 24 pieces of line equipment. We broke into smaller pods. We've gone down in the past. You have one supervisor for like 12 trucks, and you end up getting these long convoys that are a little bit cumbersome to handle. Plus, Florida is like New England, has a lot of public power communities. So it's possible that when we get to Florida, it didn't happen this time. We went to Jacksonville first, and then they transferred us to Bartow Electric, which is a little bit east of Tampa. But they could have split us up. So we wanted to make sure we had the supervisors in place to be able to adapt to whatever it was, because we went down before the storm. even made landfall. So we didn't know exactly, other than showing up to Jackson, what was going to happen when we were there.
It sounds like, not unlike the military, you've got a specific battalion or crews that are organized, as you said, 12 to 1 supervisor. You reported to Jacksonville to get your marching orders. You stayed together. Then you got dispatched to Barton. And then once you got to Barton, what happened? I know you were responsible for the crews, but as far as, okay, at pole such and such, we don't have a pole, or at this tower, we don't have a tower, because there are, again, examples of in the pictures of where you were presented with a variety of different repairs, trees that had to be taken down, wires that were entrapped, a variety of different things. So how did you know, or didn't it? Or was it just sort of like, go to this location and figure it out, and if you need materials, come back to this location? How'd that work?
Yeah, typically what happens during these events, it would happen the same here if we had a similar event. The staff that's there is overwhelmed, right? Because there wasn't just us. There's probably 300 outside individuals that went into Bartow. Their staff, their line workers who are used to working on the line, now take on a different role, and they end up being what's called the bird dog. So we'll get an area, and we'll have that line worker who has expertise in their system, who we can make sure, we understand where the source is, understand where the crews are. That's kind of their role in the restoration. So we'll get a part of the community to work on. We'll be responsible for writing it out, finding the problems, fixing the problems, and working back with that bird dog on re-energization of lines. And in stock, they typically, these places have a stockyard, they got pole yards, they'll take care of fuel, they'll take care of meals. Our number one focus typically is restoration.
But that's not, a continuous effort, Nick. Is there sort of a daily schedule that happens as far as, because as much as we'd like to paint the line crews from Littleton Electric as supermen, if I look at Trevor, I'd say that it wasn't just, let's just go until we're done. I mean, there had to be logistical issues there, as far as you point out, sleeping arrangements, feeding, the whole routine.
Yep. There is. There's a daily schedule that didn't change. It was the same schedule every day. I'll be honest. I think the New England worker would work more. They want to keep going, especially during restorations. The NEPA trained line worker that grew up and is from this area wants to work 16 to 18 hours in these events. When they want to put lights on, that's why they participate in these events. Our days probably weren't long enough for us, but you respect the community that you're helping. Bartow is a very community focused city. We had meals where we do a half an hour blessing and speech during the meal, and thanks for coming here. And the community brought in drinks and snacks, and so every place you go is a little bit different priority. And when we go to these communities, we try to respect whatever rituals it is that they have a high priority on.
That's excellent. Excellent. I'm glad to hear that Trevor was a Superman.
Yep.
All right. So we know that the line crews and LELWD work very effectively as a team. And when multiple crews are working together, that their experience, as you said, from the NEPA training, is a major factor in their safety. But how do line crews that come from different states and work together? Is it the training? Are they all trained to respond to emergencies, or what they're looking at in the same manner or methods to ensure consistent safety protocols for handling hot lines or de-energizing, re-energizing circuits? I mean, I know in the residential side of the house that you need to have an electrician that puts a lockout on a particular circuit. How does, when you have different training, how does that all work together so somebody doesn't accidentally re-energize a circuit while you're still working on it?
Yeah, it goes back to that training. It doesn't mean that every line worker is created equal. There might be different levels of skill. There might be different levels of experience. there might be different levels of risk. Some line workers will take more risk than others. That's why we go down with supervisors to make sure that as a team. So we went down with one supervisor per 4 groups, 4 line crews, which was the heaviest we ever gone down. I'm glad we did, because now you have someone that I know very well, that I trust in their safety habits, is making sure that the safety habits that at least we practice in Littleton are practiced everywhere else. And I would put the Littleton line workers, and we went down with Dave Lazar, supervisor, up there with anybody. The work habits of our crew are top notch. And it's good to go down with guys from Littleton, because I know I don't have to worry about them.
Right. So what are some of the lessons that you and the LELWD teams learned from this experience, and how do you guys normally get together to sort of debrief at a regional or a national level, Nick, so that you can say, hey, this worked really well, and this process really worked good, and there's some other things that didn't work out so well and may resulted in some things that we weren't happy with?
Yeah, I won't get into the nitty gritty and hash out our dirty laundry on LCTV. We never really did a debrief. We have a new executive director now at NEPA, who he doesn't have a military background, but he understands the military background. He came from the DC area. He's worked with the Department of Energy. He understands the battle rhythm that needs to take place with these events. And we did our first ever hot wash afterwards, and we were able to do it remotely, obviously now with technology like Zoom, with all the supervisors. So we did do an evaluation of the event afterwards, and there were lessons learned. There were always things that we could do better, and we've been learning those lessons almost individually as we go through these events. And he wrote up a report afterwards and kind of summarized the lessons learned and sent it out to the membership. So that way, when the next event happens, we can hopefully collectively build upon, this past event. It was an extremely successful event. Whenever we come back, everyone's in one piece, and we did our job.
I'm assuming then also, because of this experience, that the folks that did go are going to be passing some of those lessons learned back to the rest of the line crews here in Littleton that enrich them and make them better professionals. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Cool.
One thing I want to mention, I don't think, we don't do it enough, but we kind of hit upon it earlier in our conversation. There is going to be a hurricane that hits New England. And when the hurricane hits New England, it might be too big for us to handle. We have very good relationships with Florida from over the years of assisting their utilities in a time of need. And there's no doubt in my mind that when that hurricane changes course and hits us in New England, and we almost saw the Hurricane Henri last August, ended up being a tropical storm, but that looked like it was going to bear down on Connecticut pretty good. It was impacting Maine, Western Mass had impact, so it was a large storm that was going to have a large impact. And we had crews coming in already moving from North Carolina and Ohio, and Florida was ready to come in as well. And it's from our response to these regions that builds those relationships, and they're necessary, because eventually we will have one hit us. I hope to be retired by then, but.
Again, congratulations to the crews that went down, and to yourself. I thank you for taking the time away from your family and from Littleton. But as you say, building those relationships and the rapport with other individuals is critical when Littleton is the one who's unfortunately on the receiving end of things. And maybe in the future, for the next GM, we'll have the debriefing of how it went when we had our event where we needed the mutual aid.
One other point, Kirby, is the cost of these events. So the host utility picks up all of our costs. The Littleton ratepayer does not bear the cost of us responding to a natural disaster. And then FEMA, the federal government, if the hurricane does hit. So I think I mentioned Dorian. Dorian never hit Florida. We went to Orlando. Orlando covered that cost. But for this one here, both Jacksonville and Bartow will cover the cost of whatever cost was incurred here in Littleton.
Well, again, you're always mindful of what the residents and their bottom lines are, which in a way is kind of a segue to the next topic, Nick, which is, if I read from the Wall Street Journal headlines, New England risks winter blackouts as gas supplies tighten. Let's set the background to this routine. And then there's a bunch of questions and a bunch of education for, I think, Littleton here. One is that they make reference to ISO New England, Independent System Operators of New England, who operates, I guess, the grid for the area. And you can explain a little bit more about that and their mission with regards to making certain we have enough supply and it meets demand. But behind all of this, when you finally get back to the primary source of the information, yes, there is an impact because Russia is not exporting natural gas to the European markets. And as a result, the stuff that would normally come maybe to New England is not going to come to New England. And so as a result, we have to find possible other sources. And oh, by the way, if you looked at the news recently, National Grid just said, well, I think it's going to be 50 cents per as an increase. And I'm like, all right, anybody who's in Littleton watches the news channel or the weather channel, I should say, they start asking the questions of, okay, what does that really mean back to the residents here in Littleton as far as cost increases? How has that been planned for? You know, what are the sources of our power generation as we go towards the future? I mean, where we came from, we know it was coal-fired generators, not good for the environment. And now we have sources, the reactors up in New Hampshire at Seabrook or down at Pilgrim, but they're getting to end of life. We've got these wind farms offshore. So it's a lot of different things, and to try and boil it down into impact. Nick, I really appreciate you giving us that kind of an insight to what and how LELWD looks at this whole process.
I'm trying to think about where I want to start with this one. I'll just make a comment about ISO New England.
Yep.
So they're in charge of our grid reliability. They're supposed to be fuel agnostic, right? They're only supposed to be looking at, making sure the grid stays on. Obviously, that's not possible and gets complicated because of politics and because of future vision. That may be the right way to go, but it complicates now how to manage an electric grid because you're supposed to be making decisions based on reliability, but now you're doing it based on reliability and generation source. So it really complicates their job. Not that I want to defend ISO New England or sympathize with them, but that's kind of the problem that they're wrestling with. How do they promote transition to clean energy, and how do they do it by staying agnostic to fuel?
Yeah, I mean, just a quick interjection on the political side of it. There was a recent news piece with Senator Markey, down at ISO New England and talking about the politics that were being interjected there with the MOPR, where they allowed for natural gas to have a longer lifespan versus renewable energy. If I were looking at it as you just kind of highlighted a little bit, they're more interested in keeping the lights on and being agnostic about the energy source. And then things start getting muddied or complicated when people now say, well, why aren't you looking at solar energy, or why aren't you looking at wind power, or why, all of those questions. And
right, and to kind of add on to that, Kirby, so you mentioned a senator from one state, right? And ISO New England has 6 states in it, and I don't think the 6 states necessarily agree with timing and speed to transition. So as an independent operator, how do you balance the politics of 6 states? That's a tough thing for them to do. And then most of the electric load is in Massachusetts. So it's complicated. But to kind of, to talk about, so you really mentioned really 2 big issues, right? It's cost and reliability. And, I can touch base cost, in Littleton, we won't be going up 64%. We have the ability for long-term planning, long-term contracting. Don't quote me in the year, but I believe it was probably 2008. I believe we went through a very similar situation, was the beginning of it. In that time period, it might have been 07 and 07, but I believe it was 08 into 09. Natural gas was very volatile back then as well. I don't remember what sparked that volatility back then, but the gas prices were soaring. oil prices were soaring, and Littleton ratepayers took a little bit a hit because of that. Our rates went up a little bit, more than what was typical, and we made some lessons learned, some decisions not to do that again. And it's not that you're isolated from the markets, but you try to mitigate and minimize the impact from them. So we've had a hedging plan in place since then. That's actually what got us through that volatility back then, and we've had that in place since then, and we benefited this past year because of that hedging plan. We've been doing price locks in natural gas every year since then, looking out based on time, based on price. We have a company that all they do is monitor the volatility of natural gas and make recommendations on that. They have monthly calls, they update us on that. So there's a lot of things that we learned from that time period to make sure that we didn't go through it as hard for when it comes around again. These are very circular type events, these economic events. The energy market's been driven down for a long period of time. 2 years ago, you could buy energy in the spot market for 3 cents. This past summer it was 12 cents, 14 cents, 16 cents. We were never really interested in being in that spot market because of the risk that comes with it. So we've made long-term investments in planning to make sure that didn't happen. Now, with that being said, you can only buy so much into the future. So if something is to happen, and it won't be next year. Next year we're pretty well hedged. We will see a rate increase. We won't be able to hold the rates down to where we didn't raise it. We're probably the only utility in the state not to raise rates in 2022. We won't be as fortunate in 2023. I think we're just above 13 cents right now, kilowatt hour. I think we'll probably come in with an 8% rate increase. We'll probably be just a little bit over 14 cents kilowatt hour. You mentioned the national grid numbers. They're going to be at 48 cents a kilowatt hour. And our neighbors all around us have already gone through these rate increases. Not that it makes a rate increase in Littleton any more enjoyable, but we're doing what we can to kind of hold those down.
So let's step back a second here, Nick, is that in our electrical generation here in New England, we were very dependent upon coal, we were dependent upon nuclear, some percentage of hydro from Quebec, but there was a focus in the 2000s to get more clean, get away from coal, which basically meant we would use natural gas. We've got the shale in Pennsylvania. So, we had easy access. And so there was a big change in how electricity was generated to using gas-fired turbine generators to generate that electricity. And now we're at, 50, 60%, that's where the primary electricity generation process is fueled. And, again, if you look at ISO New England's forecast, they're saying, well, we know that Pilgrim and Seabrook are going to be tailing off, and the farms offshore are going to tail up, and we're going to look for more renewable sources. So it is, as you said, becomes political. But I know that there are a lot of people who are very vehemently, going forward with, I need it to be renewable, and I need it to be renewable at any cost. And because I've noticed that, for instance, that there's some new programs through Light and Water where if you want to be consuming clean energy, so to speak, we'll give it to you, but there's a little bit of a price that gets paid for it. So tell us about, I've given a little history. Where do you see things going as far as electric generation, so we can start insulating ourselves like, Europe is, to worry about where the sources of the gas are coming from, that it's more renewable?
Yeah, that's, again, it's a tough question because I would say, and I've been in the industry now almost 22 years, I think it's 22, maybe even longer. We've transitioned off of coal, and for the most part, diesel. There's still diesel generators out there. We've closed 2 nuclear plants, one in Vermont and one in Plymouth. Pilgrim's closed. It's not going away. That's gone.
Oh, okay. I forgot the news.
Yep, which is not good. I mean, that's base load generation. And it left the market and base load generation did not come back. Those are intermittent resources. A solar farm, a wind farm, it's intermittent. You can't dispatch it. You can't say, we have a 2-week cold snap, we need you to run. As dirty as coal is, you can store coal, you can run a generator. So when Brayton Point closes, it closed. That's a reliable resource taken out of the mix. And I mean, no one can disagree that's a dirty resource. It absolutely what it is. And I would say, I lose track of time, but probably 15 years ago, natural gas was clean, right? It was viewed upon as this is going to be our answer to leave coal. And then as soon as we started building these natural gas generators, it became dirty.
Right.
And then now in the environmentally clean generation became much more economical and became, more feasible. So I think we saw that as this is great. Here's solar, here's wind, here's offshore wind. These are all great stories and all great resources. But we haven't built enough offshore wind yet. We built hardly any. But yeah, we've closed the plants that we rely on. And it's not necessarily a problem yet. And I know you hear all the stories about potential rolling blackouts. But some of the other things we've done is we've become much more energy efficient. Our heating is more energy efficient. The lighting obviously is, system controls are. So we're doing a lot of good things that reduced our demand and our energy use while we started rolling some of this generation off. But yeah, it is scary to think what would happen with a 3-week cold snap polar vortex that we had in 2014.
I think we all want to be green, but the practical reality is the infrastructure is not there yet that supports, we're going to swap gas out and we already have renewable energy, whether it's wind or whether it's water or whatever new technology may come down, that we're going to try and supplant that 46% that's being generated from natural gas, so that we're on to the next piece. Because I'm a very practical person. It's like I would like to see renewable energy from these sources. But as you point out, most folks don't realize that when we have this polar vortex, that all of a sudden the electrical needs of the community for heating, for lighting, and everything else go up. What's the fraction? 25, 30%, Nick?
Yeah, something like that. And we have enough natural gas in the country. Our storage numbers right now are, I think, they're 3% lower than they were last year. So we have enough natural gas. We have a transportation problem in New England, and I don't need to talk about all the pipelines that haven't happened, because it doesn't really matter. But that's our issue in New England. We rely on the Everett terminal to bring in LNG tankers, and that's when you hear the threats of the LNG tankers going to Europe, that's pure economics. Natural gas for a long time has been more expensive in Europe. They're paying more for it, and it wasn't until recently that the tankers have been allowed to go there. So now, because those tankers have a global market to sell to, they're choosing, to make money.
So again, when you wish for something, you got to be careful about what you're wishing for, because it's going to come possibly, as we know, at a price. With regards to renewable resources, are still in their, I hate to say it, their infancy. And the number of those sources are few as compared to the number of gas-fired generation stations that supply New England. So again, it sounds like, I read it, started off that little section about, risk winter blackouts as supplies tighten. So in other words, they were, ISO New England was doing its job, making certain we were aware that there may be supply issues, and we've seen rates go up with the national grid side for the Boston customers and other folks. But the takeaway, I guess, we have here, Nick, is that there's supply, there's demand. It's how you get the materials from one point to another. How about the raw materials itself so they can burn it? Whether it's coal, whether it's nuclear, whether it's gas, there always has to be a source. And if you too quickly change from one source to another without having the necessary supply, you're going to see a little bit of this concern about, well, there's potential for a blackout. Am I reading that right?
Yeah, I would just caution what you're reading. So I think is it a possibility? Yes. Was it a possibility last year? Yes.
Yes.
Was it a possibility 2 years ago? Yeah. I mean, I think Gordon Van Wiley from ISO has been saying this for at least 5 years. And nothing good has happened in the generation mix in those 5 years. We haven't added any base load generation that is going to solve his problem. But for whatever reason this year, and maybe it's Texas. I mean, Texas went through their issues last year, so maybe that's what's making them a little bit more nervous and making the news a little bit more attention grabbing.
Yeah.
Because Texas went through the same, what you're describing, Texas went through.
Right.
A little bit different, obviously, but a very similar situation. Right. But Gordon's been saying this, the CEO of ISO New England for years.
Right.
It's his job to say it. Like I said, he's in charge of reliability. He needs to make sure people understand the risks with running the grid.
But as far as we know right now, Nick, to kind of tie it up in a little bow, we've got what we need, barring any unforeseen mutual aid requirements. We should be all set for this winter with regards to the lights staying on. And if you're dependent upon electricity for heating your home, we should be all set.
What I'm hoping for, Kirby, is once the national grid customers are paying 48 cents a kilowatt hour, they'll turn the lights off voluntarily, and we'll have plenty of juice to sell to everybody else.
Okay. Well, that's one way to look at it. Or we get a couple of good snowfalls and the temperatures stay up, which would be kind of weird, but it's also weird to be in November 2nd and the temperature outside's in the 60s. So go figure what climate change has done to the whole process, where we may not need it, which is not a good way of looking at it, I guess.
Interesting one.
All righty. So today we've been with Nick Lawler, General Manager of New England Electric. Listen to that. Littleton Electric.
That promotion?
Yeah, right. Giving you a promotion, Nick, right. And he's told us about mutual aid process and the challenges and the opportunities there for growing together with another community. But had a very interesting conversation about the generation of electricity in New England, how folks at Light and Water have done their forecasting with regards to supplies so that our rate per hour, I think, is 14 cents per kilowatt hour, as compared to 48 cents for national grid customers. So I think we all should be glad for the gentleman who we've been talking to and his fine team, particularly those who did go down and help with the hurricane restoration process. So again, Nick, thank you very much.
Thanks, Kirby.